Okay. So as we all know, perhaps I should introduce myself. I see a lot of my students in the audience. So I'm Anand Young, the instructor of SIS 200 for many of you. I'm a professor in the history department as well as the Jackson School. And my task here is as moderator. So what that means is I have a front row seat in this very distinguished panel. I get to monitor the amount of time each presenter takes. That is about 10 to 15 minutes each. And my task also is to make sure none of your questions turn into elaborate disquisitions on the world. So keep your questions brief and to the point. As we all know, since we live in the United States, a week is a long time in politics. Almost every day there's some sensational news or the other. So imagine thinking about the world after a long, hot summer when major conflagrations have broken out in many parts of the world. And unlike some presidential candidates, we can probably name many of the places, starting with Aleppo, where those events have occurred. And you can go Aleppo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Brussels, Nice, and on and on. And if we were thinking about late-breaking news just in the last 24 hours, there's also Frexit to add to Brexit. As many of you have heard, the referendum held on the peace brokered between FARC and the Colombian government didn't win enough support. So wherever you look in the world, things seem to be in disarray, seem to be under siege, and to many, the post-World War II international order seems to be falling apart. Or is it? Well, we're going to find out from four very distinguished speakers who are going to help navigate our world. First up will be Sabina Lang, who is sitting closest to me, who is the director of the Jackson School's Center for West European Studies. And I think her various associations tell you about the kind of research work she does. She's an associate professor of international and European studies, an adjunct professor in political science, and also in gender, women, and sexuality. Her work focuses on civil society, the public sphere, the non-governmental organizations, and gender politics in Europe. In fact, her book has 3 of those 4 concepts in the title. Next up will be Dan Shiro, who is the Ellison Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies in the Jackson School. And his latest book, and there's a whole series of works, his latest book is entitled The Shape of the New, 4 Big Ideas and How They Made the Modern World. And the title tells you something about how far and wide his interests and expertise range. He will be followed by Rashad Kasaba, who is the director of the Jackson School and Golub Chair of International Studies, and a leading authority in Ottoman Turkey, contemporary Turkey, and the Middle East. Last but not least, all the way to the far right of me, is somebody who's going to link up the global with the local and national, because we do need someone who's an expert in the United States, is Margaret O'Mara, who's an associate professor in history, so a colleague of mine over in the history department, who specializes on political, economic, and metropolitan history. And her latest book, just out in time for election season, is entitled Pivotal Tuesdays, 4 Elections That Shaped the 20th Century. Professor Lang.
Thank you. So, thanks for being here in such great numbers after a first week of classes. I'm sure you have a lot of places to go tonight. This is, as Anand has mentioned, a steep task for all of us to really make sense of this flurry of events, trajectories, and developments within the past few months, but also in a wider context. So what I'm going to try to offer you here is really two observations that relate to, and you can probably detect it already, my own home country, Germany. This is where I grew up. This is where a lot of my research still takes place, and I want to offer a couple of comments on where I see Germany going in this European crisis mode. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. And then I want to expand and talk at the end of my 10 to 15 minutes a little bit about how Germany positions itself in the European context. So first, let me start off with a couple of remarks that have to do with what we've all read in the past few months in the media, which is the idea that Germans have really abandoned their welcoming culture. Germans have pivoted from a year of 2015 in which they were very much at the forefront of embracing some kind of handling of this refugee crisis, and are now, so the media tell us, are now going towards taking back their sovereignty, and Chancellor Merkel in particular is portrayed as somebody who had really had to apologize for the way she handled the crisis in 2015. So, is that correct? I would say it's not quite correct. It is correct in the sense that indeed Germany had to act after a year of, imagine in 2015, a year of between 1.1 and 1.5 million refugees coming to the country. That is about on the scale, if you would think about the US, of 6.2 million refugees being taken in by the United States in 1 year. So what that did in 2015, as you've all read about that, is totally overload a state that usually prides itself on functioning actually quite smoothly. Germans have that thing with the smooth state, for better or for worse. In that case last year, it did not work. Total overload of anything from asylum-seeking agencies, housing agencies, health agencies, schooling. The German state did not provide, and what happened was that Angela Merkel really reacted to the plight of these refugees being stuck at the borders on the Balkan route, and single-handedly suspended the Dublin Agreement. The Dublin Agreement, which states that European Union member states or members of the Dublin Agreement, there are more than European Union member states, that those need to process asylum seekers and refugees in the first country of origin where they come into the Dublin area. Merkel at the time said, this is not working, we have to react fast, we have to react to this emergency, and she suspended Dublin and let refugees from Syria and North African countries move very fast through Hungary, through Austria into Germany. At the time, most Germans agreed with this policy. Most Germans really showed what I'd never seen in my youth, adult life, childhood in Germany before. They stepped up and did not let the state take care of things the state couldn't take care. So Germans volunteered on a really unprecedented scale. As of February 2016, we now have the first studies about that. 10% of all Germans age 14 and up are engaging in refugee volunteer activity. Now that might not sound like much for the United States, but for Germany this is really a big voluntary civil society commitment to helping. However, and I don't want to sugarcoat this policy. What has really happened and what causes the media to see a pivot right now is that Germans felt this was an emergency, this was a one-time effort to really deal with the crisis mode, but this could not be sustained over a longer period. Especially not, and I'll come to that a little later, since Merkel's idea to redistribute refugees within the European Union failed then and fails up to today. More factors contributed to a pivoting. You all might have heard of the attacks in Cologne and other German cities, also some European cities in the New Year's night of 2016, where as it stands now, we have the first solid reports where over 1,200 women were assaulted, about roughly 700 of them sexually. So that dampened public perception very much about admitting more refugees. Then terrorist attacks, of course, across Europe in this past summer. So what we're seeing is not, and this is the difference in my understanding of what I read in the media and what I want to communicate to you, what we're seeing not is that Merkel says, I'm sorry, this was the wrong thing to do. What we're seeing is that she says, if I would have known what I know now, I would have gotten Germany as early as the 2005, 2006, 2007, as the early stages of her career as Chancellor, into a more crisis preventive mode and dealt proactively with the European refugee and asylum politics. Now, of course, it's crisis mode, it's too late, so I don't see her stance really as pivoting completely. I see it as adjusting and also as a politician admitting to the fact that nobody had the refugee crisis really on its screen to the degree that it had developed. So, yes, in effect, German policy, and this is my second point, has taken a conservative turn. And a big part of what we're seeing right now as this conservative turn has to do with the fact that right-wing politics is on the rise, and particularly a brand of ultra-right-wing populism is on the rise in Germany as well as in other European states. Now again, this is correct, but I also want to put that into a little bit of a wider and maybe a little bit of a different perspective than you tend to read these days. First of all, right-wing populism is nothing new in Germany or across European countries. The Front National, and I'm sure Dan will speak to that, or maybe he will a little bit more. The Front National has been around for 30 years in France. In Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, quite regularly about 20% of the electorate are polling on the ultra-right-wing side of the political spectrum. So what is new, in my understanding, is this intertwining of a inequality and kind of marginalized discourse of right-wing populists with migration and with xenophobia. That has really accelerated the process of right-wing movements finding outlets, finding voice, finding supporters across Europe. And if you look in Germany proper, attitudinal surveys really tell us that the percentage of the population who believes that we have too many foreigners, and the percentage of the population who believes that we really should turn to more chauvinistic, inward-oriented responses to globalization, that percentage has not changed that much over the past 20 years. So the first, we don't need more foreigners, always polls in attitudinal surveys at about 20%, and the anti-globalization response, we need a strong leader, always polls at around 10%. So again, what has changed is that now we're seeing stronger movements to articulate these positions, and we're seeing increasingly parties that seem electable for people, like the Alternative for Germany, to deal with that. Secondly, and I think that goes to the heart of European democracies, what we're seeing is that populists who are always anti-pluralists, they're always anti-pluralists in the sense that they don't want to engage in much debate, but they construct themselves as being anti-politics. What I mean by that is that they come to political power really by discrediting the very sphere that they actually aspire to. So they construct a relatively homogeneous and pure people against those elites that are corrupt, that are in the pocket of business and are parasitic political elites, basically. And I think the real danger of right-wing populism in Europe does not lie in these parties actually coming to govern European states overall, but the real danger is that they discredit the political sphere per se and construct themselves as an alternative that is anti-political in being political. And I think maybe there are some connections to Trump here too that we can think about. And the third last problem with the second point is that right-wing populism is by now already massively overrepresented in institutional politics in Europe. What I mean by that is that in all studies that we're having now, ultra right-wing populist parties are represented about 2 to 3 times more than surveys tell us about how people identify with them. And that has to do, I think, with the fact not only that we're having disenfranchised voices on the ultra-right who now have the public sphere to act in and have institutional venues to articulate their opinion, but I think that has to do with the fact, and that goes back to many of us and of you in the room here, that across Europe we're seeing a lot of young people not being engaged in representative politics anymore, not voting. So on the one hand you have right-wing focused authoritarian voices who have no problem with representative party politics that are hierarchically organized, and they vote for their respective parties. On the left you have people who increasingly say, parties don't work for me. I'm not engaging with them. I want movement activities. Think of the Southern European, the Spanish M15 movement, and so on. So on the left, young people disengage with the institutional spectrum, and on the right, they embrace it to some degree. And that brings me to the third point. I hope I still have a couple of minutes. The third point, and that is that these right-wing articulations really tend to affect what Europe is and how the European Union develops. I just Googled last night the phrase EU doomed to fail, because I've read that so many times in the past few weeks, and it gets me immediately 470,000 hits. So on that front, it would look like we're really, with Brexit and recent developments, we're nailing the last nail in this coffin of the European Union. As you know by now, I'm a contrarian on these fronts. I don't think I see a real strong coffin that we need to be worried about, but I do want to say a few things that contribute to, or I want to articulate a few things that contribute to this perception before I tell you why I think they're a little bit premature. So clearly Brexit is on all our minds. The fact that on June 23rd, the UK voted with 52% to leave the European Union, and will now have 2 years to negotiate their exit. And we have, I think, not a clear idea what that will look like. Neither Brussels nor London has a very good sense of how this will go and what the output of it really will be. But what I want to point to is something that is quite similar to how we perceive populist right-wing movement. In the UK, I also think we're seeing a communication problem. We're seeing a media coverage during Brexit campaigns in which UKIP claims a whole bunch of truths that can be easily refuted, but that the British media do not really do a very good job in telling us about and in refuting. The studies that we're having that are now coming out tell us that 41% of reporting in the media on Brexit before June 23rd was about Brexit, was really about the negative aspects of pro-leave. And only 27% engaged with pro-stay issues. Coverage, and again, I think I'm seeing similarities here to the US right now, coverage focused on the horse race, on the traits of the personalities involved, but very little on the content of what it would really mean to exit. And this echoes also my earlier point about younger people. Because I was in London and North England about 2 weeks after the vote, and many of my colleagues said, we don't really think that anybody above 60 should have voted in the Brexit decision. If you look at young people, age 18 to 24, over 70% wanted to stay in the European Union. And if you look at sorry, I almost include myself, older people, 65 and up, what you have is that 90% upwards wanted to leave. So it's really a generational issue where we also have to ask, where is the young people's mobilization here to be more proactive in not letting things happen that affect your future. The same goes for what we've seen last night. Some of you might have heard that Hungary has done a referendum that is highly controversial because it really asked a question that wasn't even true in the sense that it did not represent what the EU actually wanted from Hungary, but basically the referendum was about whether the Hungarians would fulfill their quota of taking EU refugees, which would amount to 1,600 people, 1,600 refugees that the Hungarians would need to take in, and Viktor Orban, very skilled communicator, put this to a referendum. Only 43% of the population participated, and still, and that makes this rather meager referendum quota of 50% invalid, but he still argues that the majority of Hungarians do not want any refugees in the country. So, and this is why I think it's really on you young people, it's really on a lot of questions about getting to the bottom of things, which this school, the Jackson School, stands for. And it is, coming back to the EU for final moment, it is within the EU a time in which a lot of problems stack up, but at the same time, the EU has always been about solving crisis, and it has always been about a painfully slow, sometimes technocratic process of coming to terms with very, very different opinions about matters. So while it might look as though the EU is doomed to fail, I don't think so. I think we're going to see a long and painful negotiation with the UK. We're going to see a new integration and asylum law, that asylum pact, they call it now, which means that those member states who don't want to take refugees will have to pay more for the others taking them in. So it is these tiny screws that European commissioners and European parliamentarians always work with in getting consensus in an experiment that's really the only experiment of nation states giving up sovereignty and giving up control of their country, and therefore I still think a highly relevant and necessary experiment to continue. Thank you.
There's a seat up front, if anyone wants to sit. Next up is Anne Sharon.
I want to talk about the world, not about France, which is what I was supposed to talk about. But I will start with one remark about France. My wife and I were in France recently. I go to France a lot. I still have family there. And there's just something very peculiar that happened this summer. In the newspapers, you may have seen a picture of uniformed policemen arresting a woman on a beach in southern France because she was wearing what's come to be called a burkini. And she was all covered up, which is the way French women used to dress at the beach 100 years ago. But this is on a beach where those of you who have been to French beaches, where women routinely go without a top, and men and women, even if they wear bathing suits, they might as well not be. And a week later in France, it was announced in Paris, where during the summer they set up swimming pools on the Seine River with clean water, unlike the river. And they're opening up one for people who want to go swimming nude. And the hysteria over this poor woman who was kind of covered up the way a woman might have been a while ago in France on a beach where just the opposite exists shows a kind of a breakdown of, I don't know, you said communications. That's really quite startling. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I do want to talk about is about the spread of anti-democratic and xenophobic and frankly paranoid political movements led by lying and authoritarian demagogues. And it's alarming. Turkey, which we'll hear something about, Egypt, Hungary, Sabine mentioned Viktor Orban, Poland, where the leading political power is in the hands of a man named Jarosław Kaczynski. In the Philippines, you may have read some stories recently, in Russia, some would say China as well, Thailand, which has had a military coup. These are all places that a decade ago were either democratic or seemed to be heading in that direction. And that's not the case anymore, and those are not the only examples. But in established democracies as well, there are things that are happening. We all know about Brexit, we discussed that. The rise of Donald Trump in the United States, right-wing parties everywhere in Europe, Marine Le Pen, you also mentioned that, but also the man who wants to become again president of France and was, Nicolas Sarkozy, has taken a very sharp right-wing turn, anti-immigrant. Now, he's an opportunist, he'll say anything to get elected, but he might be. But I should stress that this is not just a phenomenon of the right. The rise of open anti-Semitism in parts of the European left, quite obviously in Britain's Labour Party, is not especially strong either. So what I want to say is that, unfortunately, this reminds me of the 1920s and 1930s in Europe and in some other places as well, in Asia, in particular in parts of Latin America. When this also happened, and also when, at least in Europe, the established democracies lost faith in themselves, and where so many intellectuals of both the left and the right turned their backs on the liberal enlightenment and of democracy, leaving the field open to the ideas that almost triumphed in Europe and brought humanity to the brink of the endless nightmare that George Orwell, who was one of the most decent intellectuals, of his time that George Orwell described in his ultimately very popular novel, 1984, of the food endlessly stamping on the face. And the world came surprisingly close to that. Well, is it that bad now? Well, not yet. Certainly not yet. The Great Recession of 2008, which triggered a lot of this, was not nearly as bad as the Great Depression of the 1930s. Vladimir Putin is not a Hitler, though he actually bears a surprising resemblance to Mussolini, who maybe wasn't quite as bad, was no sweetie either, including liking to have himself portrayed bare-chested as a man. He was very manly. Mussolini liked to do that too. And they have a lot in common. It's worth looking. You can see YouTube videos of Mussolini's speeches and compare the substance of what he's saying to some of the things that Putin is saying. There are other disturbing phenomena, obviously. The growing influence of radical Islam, though that really doesn't threaten the entire world the way fascism did, largely because its effects are overwhelmingly felt in Muslim countries and is keeping those societies economically weak, quite unlike what Germany and Japan were like in the 1930s. So is it as bad? No, it's not as bad. But it's still worrying. And what worries me even more than much that you've heard so far and that I've mentioned is that, as in the 1930s, the strongholds of liberal democracy are losing faith in themselves. And I should add that we academics bear some of the responsibility for this, as many of us have for decades unrelentingly attacked liberalism and the entire Enlightenment tradition from the left as a cover for Western imperialism and arrogance. So, in a sense, and of course I believe that ideas are important and intellectuals play an important role, we have left the field to those who demean liberalism and all the benefits that it's brought. And I use the term liberalism not in the narrow sense that it's used in the United States, it's somewhat more left conservatism, but part of the general liberal tradition that helped create the United States, that was at the bottom of the thinking of the founders of the United States and of liberal reforms and democratic reforms in Europe, and was associated with the rise of science and the Industrial Revolution and many, many beneficial things. We've, in a sense, as intellectuals, at least too many of us, have abandoned faith in that and left the field open to those who will attempt to destroy it. And that was very evident in Europe, at least in the 1930s, in France, and even in Britain, very much in France. And that played a terrible role in bringing about the catastrophe of the early 1940s. Now, some of the major strongholds of authoritarian anti-liberalism, particularly Russia, and in Europe, that nasty little Hungarian regime of Viktor Orban. I heard him speak in Vienna some years ago. He's a very bright man, and has a very interesting political history. But he's playing a really negative role. You know, Hungary is a not very wealthy, quite small, and declining country. He's trying to destroy the European Union, and thinks that he can have some success, and he's gained some followers among leaders in some other East and Central European countries. I didn't touch anything. I'm about to say that in darkness is about to fall on the world. But, okay, thank you. So it'll end well. So I was saying some of the major strongholds of authoritarian anti-liberalism, particularly Russia, but Hungary as well, if we look at it, are actually situated in failing societies. Russia, unlike Germany in the 1930s or the Soviet Union after World War II, Russia is a failing society. It's a society with serious demographic decline. Its economy is in bad shape. It's losing population. Hungary, people know much less about Hungary. It's a small country. It's lost. It has 10 million people. About 500,000 have left in recent years. The economy is not going well. Viktor Orban keeps on winning elections, but he's not gaining the support of young, well-educated people who have the option, because they're in Europe, of leaving and going elsewhere. And educated Hungarians have a tradition of knowing other languages well, and so they leave. And these are not societies that are going to prosper in the future. Turkey, I think, we'll hear about Turkey, where there's a regime like that, could be heading in the same direction. Egypt is already there. It remains to be seen if China will do that to itself. But in any case, China's not about to become the world's leading power, not for quite a long time, if ever. So in a sense, what we're seeing is less dangerous than what was happening in the 1930s, when the most dangerous country was Germany, which had the strongest economy in the world, the second strongest economy in the world after the United States, and was a scientific and technological powerhouse. And Japan, which was also a very powerful economy and technologically advanced country. So we're not seeing that. But what I really want to emphasize and close with is to say that what's happening in those countries does not worry me as much as was happening in the 1930s in the strong democracies of the world. It's very disheartening to see what happened in Britain with Brexit. It's not that I have a strong position on whether or not there's some real reason to be opposed to the European Union. Yes, Brussels is over-bureaucratized and all that, but the way in which that campaign was conducted was one of big pessimism and paranoia, and it caught on. It's happening here in the United States, and it's happening all over Europe, and it's happening in the world in places that should be and remain strong democracies, but that have, in a sense, lost faith in themselves. You know, whether Putin, I'm sorry, it's a funny slip, whether Trump wins or not. It looks as if he probably won't win, but whether he wins or not, he does represent a real phenomenon. And it's a very gloomy, dark, pessimistic phenomenon. And that worries me more than the prospects of his party winning an election or not. There's something going on. And we, not just we as professors, but as intellectuals, and you also as intellectuals or becoming intellectuals, have a role to play in this. And as Sabine said in her closing remarks, what happens with the opinion and ability to mobilize against these trends among young people is really what is going to determine the future. Will we keep on sliding in that direction? If we do, it will be a catastrophe. And if we do, we might someday, those of us who are still around, look back and look at this period the way we could look at the late 1920s and 1930s, when in Europe, Britain and France, the leading democracies, lost faith in themselves and left the way open to something much darker.
Michelle Casilva, the director of the Jackson School, will be speaking next. Inject some hope and optimism into this discussion. Let's turn to American politics.
Thank you. You stole my opening line. It's great to be here, and thank you all for so much food for thought. And I think what I'd like to do is kind of end by not only moving us over space, but moving us over time. And to really elaborate a little further on Dan True's comparison with an earlier era of the 1920s and 1930s, but particularly to home in on the 1920s in the United States as a moment of where there are a lot of similarities and parallels that might be worth mulling over a bit. You have a decade of internationalism, of interventionism, where the United States moves away from its historic isolationism over the other side of the Atlantic to not only first imperial engagement in the Spanish-American War, a very bullish imperialist, flashy president, public figure in the form of Theodore Roosevelt, but then followed by Woodrow Wilson, who leads America after some promises of keeping America out of the war. America goes into the war in the last 2 years of the Great War. And Wilson comes out of it with a new approach to internationalism, making an argument that the United States should engage in the world, should be an exporter of American democracy, and should be a leader of global international collaboration to preserve and restore world peace. And as we know from the history of the League of Nations, that didn't quite turn out as he had originally hoped. And this moment of international engagement and globalism, which of course comes on the heels of 2 decades of intense immigration into the United States. Immigration at a scale that had not been seen, certainly the numbers had not been seen before, and percentage-wise a insert of people of new Americans from parts of the world that were practicing different religions, speaking different tongues, cooking different food, wearing different clothes, and really challenging the notion of the native-born and the people who were already here of what was American. Another of this constant wave of newcomers coming into the United States, starting with the first Europeans, where the newest group to arrive is always seen as the most foreign, as the most dangerous, and one to be kept out. And so after this decade of internationalism, the United States closes in the 1920s. And we have a lot of, we have a dynamic, many other dynamics that are comparable to today, and I think maybe decenter our very contemporary narrative of all this is new. We have new communication platform, radio, and movies, Hollywood film, ubiquitous, cacophonous, open, unveiling things that were formerly hidden, finding channels of communication for people to speak directly to one another, for politicians to speak directly to voters, for example, in ways that were much more personal, for radio personalities to emerge not only for entertainment but also as political figures, which really blossoms in the United States in the 1930s with someone who is definitely a predecessor of Donald Trump, Charles Coughlin, the radio priest from Detroit, who was a populist antagonist of Franklin Roosevelt and quite a personality. There was also a growing consumer culture and one that created whole new worlds of credit and debt. Americans were going into debt like never before because now they can borrow to buy things like automobiles and washing machines. And you have a giant new commodity product, this high-tech commodity project coming out of Detroit, the automobile. It's transforming American life on so many dimensions in a way that the products of Silicon Valley, the internet, the computer hardware and software have transformed this generation. You also have a high degree of skepticism and dislike for established institutions and their representative leaders. There was plenty of people who felt we should throw the bombs out. And there was a suspicion of, a populist suspicion of centralized power that has been a perennial in American political life. This is something that is not new today, was not new in the 1920s, and really goes all the way back to the founding of the United States. There is a fear of foreign ideas, to go to your point, Sean, about Turkey. this real sort of on the heels of this Southern and Eastern European immigration and the Bolshevik Revolution, a real fear of rising socialism, which is given quite an exclamation point by acts of domestic terrorism, including a bombing of J.P. Morgan's Wall Street offices in the early part of the decade, and a real turning inward and pushing the newcomers out, very restricted, increasingly restrictive immigration laws culminating in the Immigration Act of 1924, which puts pretty stiff quotas on immigration and makes it pretty darn difficult to immigrate from anywhere in the world unless you're Canadian or British for about a couple of generations. And you have a remarkable opening up of rights. Women are granted the vote, for example, and also a growing presence of Catholics in politics. People like Al Smith, for example, which is met with resistance and retaliation against those rights. The 1920s, of course, is the age of the modern Ku Klux Klan, a national phenomenon, including in the Pacific Northwest, and a very modern phenomenon, aided by modern communications platforms, by pamphleteers and radio, and we think of the KKK as a sort of archaic Reconstruction, post-Civil War phenomenon, but the KKK of the 1920s was very modern. It was very much a response to the immigration, the influx of immigration, particularly of Jews and Catholics, as well as African Americans, restricting African American rights in the South. You have a lot of disengaged young people, a generation gap, young people who feel very, very differently about the world than their parents and are also engaged in other pursuits, and a geographic divide that is really falls out of this narrative that we have of the roaring 20s, of the Jazz Age. The 20s were not roaring for everyone. They were roaring if you lived in cities. The Great Depression was very much with most of rural America by the middle part of the 1920s, which is one of the reasons the Great Depression did become the Great Depression. That rural America experienced the 1920s very, very differently. They also had very different social values. They had very different economic bases. Their understanding of what was American, what made America great, was considered to be very different if you lived in a small town or on a farm and if you lived in a big city. And so that polarization is all present. Now, am I saying this means, okay, we're just headed to the Great Depression, bring it on? No, there's a lot of contingency, there's a lot of other things that are different. I mean, the US goes headlong to the 1930s, you have a stock market crash, but you also have worldwide economic fragility. You also have a lack of government institutions, an amazingly anemic central government. You know, there's no FDIC, there's no safety net whatsoever. And funnily enough, this 1920s of increased polarization and isolationism culminates in the election of a president who, while he was no socialist, he was a good old capitalist, Franklin Roosevelt, but he was a believer in really revamping capitalism and using government to make capitalism work better and to create an economic safety net that was publicly provided. So a liberalism follows on this moment. So, and I also want to, I bring up the 1920s not to say, let's watch history repeat itself, but to point out that a lot of the conditions that we're experiencing here in 2016 are very familiar ones. And I want to underscore that point by saying that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and their respective presidential campaigns have been 50 years at least in the making. Donald Trump is the product of 50 years of the Republican Party and other populist politicians and movements in and around, off and on the American right. Hillary Clinton is the product of a Democratic Party that was a party of consensus liberalism, of classical, of liberal, and who then moved to the new left of the 1960s, and then embraced a new Democrat, a middle path, the third way, embodied by Hillary Clinton's husband, Bill Clinton. And in a way, Hillary Clinton of today, the hawkish Hillary Clinton, the strong the presidential candidate who's promising to be strong, and to be and will probably be a highly interventionist president, I would imagine. Reminds me a lot more of the consensus liberals of the mid-century than she does of earlier Democratic candidates and presidents. But that is all to be seen, and historian's job is not to crystal ball gaze, but to look backward and understand. So in thinking about this moment, if we look at the 1920s, and then we also look at what has happened since the 1960s. In the 1960s, many similar conditions are emerging in the 1960s, 1970s that we see in the 1920s. And they play out in different ways, but also similarly. You have a disruptive communications platform, television, followed by cable television, a polarizing 24/7 communications platform that redefines what news is and lowers the bar for what's acceptable to be broadcast on national television, because you just got to fill the space. You have a high degree of political and economic polarization, which is precipitated by technological change, global economic restructuring, and the end of this really weird 25-year blip of prosperity that America experienced after World War II, that we came to think of as normal. And that is, so these things are contributing to this economic disaffection. And in some ways, I think going back to where we started in talking about Germany and how the Trump phenomenon relates to other right-wing movements in Europe and elsewhere. My take on Donald Trump is he ripped the Band-Aid off the nasty that's been lurking underneath American political discourse and American politics all this time. Donald Trump is George Wallace. Donald Trump is Charles Coughlin. Donald Trump is Joe McCarthy. Donald Trump is playing to this populist anxiety that rises in time with great demographic change, economic change, and moments of globalization, and also moments of expanded opportunity. And so, in a way, looking at these as not these aberrant phenomena that come out of nowhere helps us understand the role of structural political institutions, very dynamic political institutions, mind you, that have morphed and changed over time quite radically. The Republican Party today is not the party of Nelson Rockefeller or even the party of Barry Goldwater. But if we put it in the long view, this is where I'm going to end on my note of hope. Darn it. That we also can have a healthier perspective about what might come next. That none of what might come, there's no inevitability in history. There is a power, and these forces rise up in such, the forces of hate often rise up in response to enlarged opportunity and hope, and to mass action in a positive direction. And I go to everyone here has talked about the power of the young and the demographics. And that's my take on, if I'm going to crystal ball gaze on what's going to happen in 34 days, good Lord, can't come soon enough, is I believe in demographics, I believe in numbers. Just as the demographics of the 1920s and the 1960s and 70s and 80s mapped out what was going to happen electorally, we have a shrinking, those who are the forces of conservatism, and I mean that not by political conservatism, but keeping things the way they are or were, some idealized past, are shrinking, and the new generation of opportunity and tolerance is growing. So get out the vote, folks. Thanks. You're right.
There you have 4 very rich presentations on a very complex one. I'm sure you have lots of questions, so fire away and please direct them towards one of the speakers. Please.
Yes, thank you so much.